On 35th Avenue, a man vanished, and Nero Wolfe smelled a lie. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your voices matter. Let's begin. At 11:15 on a Tuesday morning in late October, I was at my desk in the office on West 35th Street, pretending to update the germination records for Wolfe's orchids, while actually wondering whether the redhead at Rusterman's had been flirting or just being professionally friendly when she asked if I wanted extra cream with my coffee. The weather outside was doing its best impression of a wet gray blanket, and Fritz was in the kitchen making enough noise with pots and pans to wake the dead, which in our business sometimes isn't entirely metaphorical. Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms at 11 sharp, as he does every morning except when the world ends, and was now settled behind his desk like a mountain that had decided to take up permanent residence. He was reading a book about Byzantine cooking techniques and looking as if the very existence of the 20th century was a personal affront. The beer bottle at his elbow was already half empty, which meant he was in what passed for a good mood. When the doorbell rang, I glanced at him. He didn't move, but one eyebrow twitched, which in Wolfe's vocabulary meant I should answer it before he was forced to acknowledge that other people existed. I went to the front hall and looked through the one-way glass panel. A woman stood on the stoop, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back severely and a black coat that looked expensive but not showy. She had the kind of face that suggested she spent her days making decisions other people didn't want to make. I opened the door. She looked me over with quick, efficient eyes and said, "I need to see Nero Wolfe. It's about my brother. He's vanished." "Vanished how?" I asked, because in our line of work people vanish in all sorts of interesting ways, and most of them involve either money or marriage or both. "He was walking to this house yesterday afternoon to see Mr. Wolfe. I watched him from my apartment window across the street. He was carrying a briefcase. He walked past that delivery truck." She pointed to a spot on the curb. I looked away for maybe 10 seconds to answer the phone. When I looked back, he was gone. The truck was gone. The street was empty. That was more interesting than the usual missing person story. I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. I'm Archie Goodwin." "What's your name?" "Margaret Ashford." She walked past me with the kind of posture that suggested finishing school and a trust fund. "My brother is Dr. James Ashford. He's a medievalist at Columbia University. He specializes in manuscript authentication." I led her to the office and gestured to the red leather chair. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap, not looking around the room with curiosity like most first-time visitors. Whatever was bothering her had her complete attention. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "this is Margaret Ashford. Her brother disappeared yesterday while walking to our front door." Wolfe looked up from his book with the expression of a man who had been interrupted while contemplating the perfect source. "I don't find people, Miss Ashford. I solve problems. If your brother chose to absent himself, that's not a problem I can address." "He didn't choose anything," she said, her voice level and controlled. "Something happened to him, and he was bringing you something important." Wolfe's eyes shifted to her face. "What sort of something?" "A manuscript, a medieval text that he'd been asked to authenticate. He called me yesterday morning, very excited. He said he'd discovered something extraordinary, something that would change how we understand 13th century literature. He was bringing it to you because he'd heard you were knowledgeable about rare books and because he was frightened." "Frightened of what?" "He wouldn't say exactly. But he mentioned that other people knew about the manuscript, people who weren't scholars, people who might be willing to kill for it." Wolfe closed his book and reached for his beer. "Did he say where he obtained this manuscript?" "An estate sale in Westchester. The previous owner was a collector named Pemberton who died last month. James said the manuscript was misfiled, that the estate lawyers didn't know what they had. But after he bought it and began his research, he realized other people were looking for it too. His apartment was broken into 3 days ago. Nothing was taken, but his files were searched. And you reported this to the police. I tried. They said adults have the right to disappear, and that I should wait 48 hours before filing a missing person report. But James wouldn't just vanish. He's methodical, careful, and he was scared enough to bring the manuscript to you instead of keeping it at the university. Wolfe drank his beer and set down the glass. What makes you think he was carrying this manuscript when he disappeared? Margaret Ashford reached into her purse and pulled out a key. Because he gave me this yesterday morning. It's to a safe deposit box at the Merchants' Trust on Lexington Avenue. He said if anything happened to him, I should give the key to Nero Wolfe and tell you to look for the Pemberton Codex. Wolfe stared at the key for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him to meet us at the Merchants' Trust in 1 hour. He turned back to Margaret Ashford. My fee is high, Miss Ashford. I can pay it. Then we have work to do. I went to my desk and called Saul Panzer, reaching him on the second ring as usual. Saul has the reliability of a Swiss watch and about half the personality, which makes him perfect for surveillance work. I told him we had a client with a missing brother, a safe deposit box that needed visiting, and the possibility that someone might take an unhealthy interest in our activities. He said he'd meet us at the Merchants' Trust in 40 minutes, which meant he was already putting on his coat. Margaret Ashford sat in the red leather chair, clutching her purse with the intensity of someone holding on to the last life-preserver on a sinking ship. Wolfe had returned to his Byzantine cookbook, but I could tell he was listening to every word we'd spoken. When Wolfe appears to ignore you completely, that's when he's paying the closest attention. Miss Ashford, I said, before we go, tell me about your brother's habits. Was he the type to take precautions, to think ahead about problems? She considered this carefully. James was methodical about everything. He kept detailed records of his research, his correspondence, his appointments. If he put something in a safe deposit box, he would have documented it somewhere. He wasn't impulsive. And the people who knew about the manuscript? You mentioned 3 names. Professor Kearns, his department chair at Columbia, Evelyn Pemberton, the collector's daughter who handled the estate sale, and Victor Lane, the London dealer. But there might have been others. James said the manuscript had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. I made a note to follow up on that last comment. In my experience, unexpected quarters usually meant trouble. We left the brownstone at 12:15, with Wolfe's parting instruction to bring him everything we found, whether it seemed important or not. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle that made the city look like it was dissolving around the edges. The taxi ride to Lexington Avenue took 20 minutes through traffic that moved like arthritic fingers. Margaret stared out the window without really seeing the passing storefronts and pedestrians. Whatever she was thinking about, it wasn't pleasant. I used the time to watch our surroundings, checking for anyone who might be following us. A gray sedan stayed behind us for 6 blocks, then turned off at Park Avenue. It might have been coincidence, but in our business, coincidence is usually just poor observation. Saul was waiting outside the bank, reading a newspaper and looking like any other New Yorker killing time. He folded the paper when he saw us and fell into step beside Margaret as we approached the entrance. "Quiet morning," he said, which was his way of telling me nobody had shown unusual interest in our destination. Inside, the bank maintained that hushed atmosphere of respectful capitalism that makes you want to whisper and count your money. Margaret presented the key and her identification to a manager whose mustache looked like it had been installed with surveying equipment. After the usual verification rituals, we were escorted to the vault and shown to a private viewing room with a table and 3 chairs. The safe deposit box was smaller than I'd expected, about the size of a cigar box, but heavier. Margaret inserted her key, the bank manager inserted his, and the metal door swung open with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, were 3 items that definitely weren't a medieval manuscript. The first was a leather-bound notebook, the kind you could buy at any stationery store for $2. Margaret lifted it out carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "This is James's handwriting," she said, opening it to the first page. The entries were dated, starting 3 weeks ago. October 8th. Pemberton estate sale successful. Acquired item 47. Initial examination promising. October 12th. Verification complete. This changes everything. Must be careful about disclosure. October 15th. Someone else knows. Received inquiry from London, VL asking specific questions. The second item was a manila envelope containing 8 high-resolution photographs of manuscript pages. The images showed medieval text with illuminated capitals, exactly what you'd expect from a 13th century codex. But on the back of the last photograph, in James's careful script, was a note. Authentication complete. Provenance verified through 3 independent sources. If anything happens to me, give this evidence to Nero Wolfe. He will understand the significance. The third item was a small brass key attached to a paper tag with an address on East 79th Street and the notation, Storage Unit 42. "He moved it," Margaret said, staring at the key. "The manuscript isn't here. He put it somewhere else." Saul examined the photographs while I studied the notebook. The entries became increasingly worried as the dates progressed. James had been watching people who were watching him. He'd noted license plate numbers, described men in grey coats who appeared too often in his neighborhood, recorded phone calls that ended when he answered. The last entry was dated yesterday. "They know I'm bringing it to Wolfe, moving to secondary location tonight. If this goes wrong, M has the bank key." "Your brother was scared," I told Margaret, "but he was also smart. He set up a trail for us to follow." We photographed everything with my phone, then returned the items to the box. The storage unit key I kept, along with the address. As we left the bank, Saul stayed behind to watch for anyone who might take an interest in our departure. Margaret and I took a taxi back to the brownstone, arriving just as Wolfe was finishing his lunch. He listened to my report without interruption, examining the photographs on my phone with the concentration he usually reserved for orchid catalogues. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for 30 seconds, which meant he was arranging facts like chess pieces. "The storage unit," he said finally. "You will visit it this afternoon. Take Saul and Miss Ashford, but first, call this Professor Kearns and arrange an interview. If Dr. Ashford confided his discovery to anyone, it would be his department chair. And Archie, be circumspect. We now know that at least 3 people were aware of Dr. Ashford's find. We don't yet know which of them decided to act on that knowledge." The phone rang before I could answer. I picked it up on the second ring. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. The voice on the other end was cultured, with a slight British accent. "Mr. Goodwin, my name is Victor Lane. I believe you've been asking questions about a certain medieval manuscript. I think we should meet." I looked at Wolfe. His eyes were open now, and they had that flat shine that meant the game was getting interesting. I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe. He was studying his beer glass as if it contained the secrets of the universe, but I could tell he was listening to every word. After a moment, he made a small gesture with his hand that meant I should continue the conversation while he decided how much rope to give our caller. "Mr. Lane," I said, uncovering the phone. "That's quite a coincidence. We were just discussing your interest in medieval manuscripts." "I suspect there are no coincidences in this matter, Mr. Goodwin." Lane's voice had the kind of cultured precision that comes from expensive schools and careful practice. "Dr. Ashford contacted me last week regarding authentication services. When I learned of his disappearance, I became concerned for his welfare. And for the manuscript, of course." "Of course. Where would you like to meet?" "I'm staying at the Carlisle. Perhaps we could arrange something this afternoon." I looked at Wolfe again. This time he nodded once, which meant he wanted the meeting, but on his terms. "Make it 6 o'clock," I said. "At Mr. Wolfe's office. You know the address." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to suggest Lane didn't appreciate being redirected. 6 o'clock at the Brownstone. Very well. I look forward to meeting Mr. Wolfe. I believe we have much to discuss. The line went dead. I hung up and turned to face the room. He knows about the safe deposit box. That's the only way he could have connected us to the case this quickly. Or Miss Ashford's inquiries were noted by someone with connections to Mr. Lane, Wolfe said. Either way, he's revealed himself prematurely. That suggests urgency, which works in our favor. Archie, we need to visit that storage unit before Mr. Lane arrives. Take Saul and Miss Ashford. I want to know what we're negotiating for. We left the Brownstone at 2:30. The rain had stopped, but the sky looked like it was saving up for another try. Saul met us at the corner, and we took a taxi to East 79th Street. Margaret sat between us, clutching her purse and staring out the window at the passing city. Whatever she was thinking, it wasn't making her happy. The storage facility was one of those climate-controlled places that charge premium rates to keep your junk at exactly the right temperature. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and had the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they're recovering from surgery. A clerk behind bulletproof glass checked Margaret's identification twice before buzzing us through a steel gate. Unit 42 was on the second floor, down a corridor lined with identical orange doors. Saul examined the lock before Margaret used her key. "Professional work," he murmured, pointing to fresh scratches around the cylinder. "Somebody with the right tools and plenty of time." The door rolled up with a metallic rattle. Inside was a small office setup: desk, chair, reading lamp, and a gray steel safe bolted to the floor. The safe door hung open, its locking mechanism destroyed by what looked like a combination of drilling and sledgehammer work. "They knew what they were doing," Saul said, examining the damage. "This wasn't a smash and grab. They came prepared for this specific safe." I stepped inside and checked the interior. Empty, except for a single piece of paper lying on the bottom shelf. I picked it up carefully. It was a receipt from Mercury Secure Transit, dated yesterday at 4:15 in the afternoon. "He moved it again," I told Margaret, showing her the receipt. "Your brother hired a courier service to relocate the manuscript yesterday afternoon." "But he told me it was here," she said, staring at the empty safe. "He told you that yesterday morning. By afternoon, something had spooked him enough to move it again. The question is where." Saul was studying the receipt over my shoulder. Mercury Secure Transit. They're expensive and discreet. If they picked it up, they'll have a delivery record. But getting that information won't be easy. We locked up the empty unit and headed back downtown. I dropped Saul off to work his contacts at the courier service while Margaret and I continued to Columbia University. Professor Kearns had agreed to see us at 3:30, and I wanted to know who else had been pressuring James about the manuscript. Kearns's office was in Fairweather Hall, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought students needed to suffer for their education. His office was on the 4th floor, a cramped space that smelled of old books and fresh anxiety. Kearns himself was a thin man in his 60s with the kind of precise movements that suggested he'd spent his life handling fragile things. "Miss Ashford," he said, rising from behind a desk covered with student papers. "I'm terribly sorry about James. Please sit down. I've been worried since he missed yesterday's faculty meeting." "Professor," I said, taking the chair across from his desk, "we need to know who else was interested in the Pemberton Codex. Dr. Ashford was clearly running scared, and we need to understand why." Kearns leaned back in his chair, which protested with a sharp creak. James was excited about his discovery, but he was also paranoid. The manuscript appeared to be a previously unknown text from the 13th century, possibly connected to Arthurian literature. If authentic, it would be quite significant. "Who knew about it besides you?" "Several people, unfortunately. Victor Lane contacted James directly about purchasing it. There was also Evelyn Pemberton, the woman who sold it to him at the estate sale. She called me last week, quite upset. She claimed she'd made a mistake, that the manuscript belonged to someone else and shouldn't have been sold. Margaret leaned forward. What did she want? She offered to buy it back for 3 times what James had paid. When he refused, she became threatening. She said there would be consequences if he didn't return it. I made a note of that. Anyone else? A collector named Everett Walsh from Boston. He seemed to know specific details about the manuscript that he shouldn't have known, and there was some interest from European dealers, though James was vague about the details. What about the content of the manuscript? What made it so valuable? Kearns hesitated, then said, James believed it contained historical information that certain institutions would prefer remained hidden. He was always dramatic about these things, but in this case, his paranoia may have been justified. We left Columbia at 4:15. The afternoon was getting darker, and the traffic was beginning to thicken with the early rush-hour crowd. Margaret was quiet during the taxi ride back to the brownstone, lost in thoughts that didn't look pleasant. Your brother was smart, I told her as we pulled up to West 35th Street. He kept moving the manuscript, kept changing the game. That means he was still alive and thinking yesterday afternoon. But where is he now? She asked. That's what we're going to find out. Starting with Mr. Lane in 90 minutes. We walked up the steps to the brownstone. Fritz met us at the door with the news that Saul had called. The courier service had a delivery record, but getting the details was going to take some persuasion. Wolfe was in the office, reading and waiting. In an hour and a half, Victor Lane would arrive with whatever story he'd prepared. The game was getting more complicated, but that's how Wolfe liked it. The more pieces on the board, the more chances for someone to make a mistake. At 5:30, I called Saul back to check on his progress with Mercury Secure Transit. His contact at the insurance company had come through with more details than I'd expected. The courier who picked up the package from James's storage unit had made 2 stops after leaving East 79th Street. The first was at a book bindery called The Gilded Page on West 22nd Street, where he dropped off what he described as a small wrapped item. The second stop was at the offices of Reddick, Moore, and Klein on Madison Avenue, where he delivered the main package at 5:45 yesterday evening. 2 deliveries, I told Wolfe after relaying Saul's information. James split whatever he had. The lawyers got the bulk of it, but something went to this book bindery first. Wolfe opened his eyes and considered this. A bookbinder would be a logical choice for manuscript preservation. Dr. Ashford was creating redundancy, ensuring that if one location was compromised, the other might survive. It suggests he expected to be intercepted, which means he knew someone was closing in on him. Indeed. And now we know that whoever took him was too late to prevent the deliveries. They found an empty safe and are still searching. He glanced at the clock on his desk. Mr. Lane will arrive shortly. His reaction to these developments should prove instructive. Margaret had joined us in the office, looking somewhat restored after Fritz's ministrations, but still carrying that taut alertness of someone waiting for bad news. When the doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, she straightened in her chair like a soldier coming to attention. I went to the front door and found Victor Lane on the stoop, exactly as I'd expected him to look. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of tailored overcoat that whispered rather than shouted about money. His face had the practiced neutrality of a diplomat or a high-stakes poker player. "Mr. Lane," I said, opening the door wider. "Right on time." "Punctuality is a virtue in my profession," he replied, stepping into the hall with the fluid movement of a man comfortable in expensive spaces. His accent was cultured British with undertones that suggested time spent in other capitals where serious money changes hands. I took his coat and hat and led him to the office. Wolfe remained seated behind his desk, naturally, but inclined his head perhaps a quarter inch in acknowledgement. Lane took the red leather chair I indicated, crossed his legs with precision, and waited. It was a good tactical choice. Most people feel compelled to fill silence, but Lane seemed content to let Wolfe make the opening move. Wolfe studied him for a long moment, then reached for his beer glass. "Mr. Lane, you telephoned claiming knowledge of a medieval manuscript and suggesting we should meet. State your business plainly." "I have no patience for elaborate preambles." "Very well." Lane's voice carried the kind of authority that comes from years of negotiating delicate transactions. "I represent certain institutional interests concerned with the recovery of historical documents. Dr. Ashford contacted me last week regarding authentication services for a manuscript he'd acquired. When I learned of his disappearance, I became concerned both for his welfare and for the document's security." "What institutional interests?" I asked. Lane's eyes shifted to me briefly, then back to Wolfe. "A consortium of European foundations dedicated to preserving medieval scholarship. They prefer to remain anonymous, but their resources are considerable, and their commitment to proper stewardship is absolute." "Flummery," Wolfe said flatly. "You flew from London on short notice. You've been making inquiries about Dr. Ashford's movements and associates. That suggests urgency beyond mere scholarly interest. What makes this manuscript worth such attention?" Lane hesitated, and I could see him calculating how much truth to deploy. "The item in question is what scholars call a palimpsest. The visible text appears to be a 13th century theological work, but beneath it lies an older document that was scraped away and written over. My clients have reason to believe the underlying text contains historical information of extraordinary sensitivity, such as genealogical records, political allegations, documents that certain modern institutions would prefer remained buried." Lane leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Wolfe, this is not merely about academic prestige. If this manuscript surfaces in the wrong hands, it could destabilize relationships between major European institutions that have taken centuries to establish." Wolfe set down his beer glass with a soft click. "You're suggesting the manuscript contains evidence of historical improprieties that would embarrass contemporary organizations. That's a motive as old as power itself." "Precisely. And there are others who know of its existence. Everett Walsh, for instance, is an unscrupulous dealer who would strip away the upper text to reveal the lower one, likely destroying the document's integrity in the process. He has no interest in preservation, only profit. And Miss Pemberton? A foolish woman who sold something she didn't understand and now regrets her haste. But she's not the primary concern. Walsh has resources and connections to violent men. If he obtains the manuscript, it will be lost to legitimate scholarship forever." Margaret spoke for the first time since Lane had arrived. "You offered my brother $500,000 for an academic text. That's not the behavior of a preservation society." Lane turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Ashford, I offered fair market value for an object whose importance extends far beyond its scholarly merit. Your brother understood the stakes. In our final conversation, he expressed concern about his safety and asked me to contact Mr. Wolfe if anything happened to him." "When was this conversation?" Wolfe asked. "Monday afternoon. He called me from his apartment, quite agitated. He said someone had been watching him, that his files had been searched. He was planning to move the manuscript to a secure location and seek professional protection." I exchanged glances with Wolfe. That timeline fit with what we knew about the storage unit and the courier deliveries. "Did he say where he was moving it?" "He mentioned a law firm, attorneys he trusted with sensitive matters. He also said he was taking additional precautions, creating what he called insurance copies in case the original was compromised." "Insurance copies," Wolfe repeated thoughtfully. "That suggests he photographed or transcribed portions of the text." "Quite possibly. Your brother was methodical, Miss Ashford. If he suspected danger, he would have prepared contingencies." The phone rang. I picked it up and heard Saul's voice, tense with urgency. "Archie, We've got movement at the book bindery. 2 men just forced the front door. They're inside now with flashlights. Professional work? Very professional. They knew exactly where to go. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. The gilded page is being searched. 2 men, professional approach. Lane's composure cracked slightly. That would be Walsh's people. They're more resourceful than I'd hoped. He turned to Wolfe with something approaching desperation. Mr. Wolfe, if they find what they're looking for, Dr. Ashford's life may be forfeit. These men don't leave witnesses. Wolfe drummed his fingers once on the arm of his chair, a sure sign he was making a decision. Mr. Lane, you will return to your hotel and await my instructions. Make no contact with anyone regarding this matter. If you attempt to circumvent my authority, I will ensure that your clients' names become publicly associated with extortion and theft. But the manuscript will be recovered through proper channels. You may go. After I'd shown Lane out, I returned to find Wolfe staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man contemplating a particularly challenging chess problem. Margaret sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. So, I said, settling into my desk chair, do we believe him? Partially, Wolfe replied. He's certainly not telling us everything, but his fear appears genuine. The question is whether he fears for Dr. Ashford's safety or for his own prospects if the manuscript falls into the wrong hands. Either way, we need to get to that law firm before Walsh's people figure out where the main package went. Indeed. But first, we need to understand what we're truly dealing with. Archie, call Fritz. We'll have an early dinner. Then we're going to pay a visit to Reddick, Moore, and Klein. The game was accelerating, and I had the feeling that before the night was over, we'd know exactly what James Ashford had discovered that was worth killing for. Fritz served dinner at 7:15, which violated the sacred rhythm of the brownstone but earned no complaint from Wolfe. He attacked his braised duck with cherry sauce with the methodical precision of a man who knows that proper digestion requires undivided attention, even when the world outside threatens to intrude with manuscripts and missing persons. Margaret picked at her food, glancing repeatedly at the clock, but Wolfe's dinner table operates under its own laws. And business discussion during meals ranks somewhere between blasphemy and treason. When we returned to the office at 8:30, the atmosphere shifted like a theater curtain rising. Wolfe settled behind his desk and produced 2 documents from his drawer, sliding them across to Margaret with the efficiency of a man who had planned every move during dessert. Sign these, Miss Ashford. The first grants Mr. Goodwin authority to act on your behalf regarding your brother's property. The second is a letter of introduction to Mr. Reddick, informing him that you have retained my services and that Mr. Goodwin represents both of us in this matter. She signed with steady hands, the tremor that had plagued her earlier apparently conquered by necessity. Will they cooperate? Lawyers understand liability better than most people. They also understand that holding property under mysterious circumstances while the owner has vanished creates more problems than releasing it to authorized representatives. Wolfe looked at me. Archie, you will secure the package and return immediately. Take no unnecessary risks, but be prepared for opposition. Mr. Lane's anxiety suggests that others are moving tonight. I checked my watch, pocketed the documents, and grabbed my coat. The night had turned colder, with a wind that cut through the streets like a knife through butter. The taxi ride to Madison Avenue took 20 minutes through traffic that moved with the sluggish determination of cold molasses. The building housing Reddick, Moore, and Klein was one of those midtown towers that whisper about money rather than shout about it. The lobby was marble and brass, with security lighting that made everything look important. A guard at the desk looked up from his newspaper as I approached. Jonathan Reddick, I told him, showing one of Wolfe's cards. He's expecting me. The guard made a call, spoke briefly, then directed me to the elevators. 14th floor. Mr. Reddick will meet you at reception. Jonathan Reddick turned out to be a compact man in his 50s with the alert wariness of someone who had spent years reading contracts for hidden traps. He met me as the elevator opened, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes showing the strain of a man carrying unwelcome secrets. "Mr. Goodwin, thank you for coming so promptly. When Miss Ashford called this afternoon, I wasn't certain how to proceed, but given the circumstances..." He led me down a corridor lined with portraits of distinguished dead lawyers. "James delivered a package to us yesterday evening with very specific instructions." He seemed genuinely frightened, which was quite unlike him. We entered his office, where a steel document case sat on the mahogany desk like a small fortress. "What were his instructions?" I asked. "That we hold the package unopened unless he failed to contact us within 48 hours, or unless his sister arrived with proper authorization to act on his behalf." He was quite explicit about the time limit and about trusting no one else. Reddick glanced at his watch. "We've had some unusual inquiries today. A British gentleman claiming to represent cultural foundations. Another caller who refused to identify himself but seemed to know specific details about the contents." "When was the last call?" "About an hour ago. Someone claiming to be James himself, saying he was coming to retrieve the package, but something was wrong with the voice, the cadence. James is always precise, measured. This person was hurried, almost frantic." Reddick opened the document case and withdrew a wrapped package about the size of a large book. "James told me that if anyone claiming to be him ever asked for this back, I should ask about something called the Tamerlane reference. If they couldn't provide the correct response, I was to refuse." "And did you ask?" "I tried. The caller laughed it off, said there was no time for games. That's when I decided to wait for you." He handed me the package, which had more weight than its size suggested. "Mr. Goodwin, I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've never had a client disappear while holding something that generates this level of interest from strangers." I tucked the package under my arm, feeling the solid weight of whatever James Ashford had considered worth hiding. "Mr. Reddick, I suggest you leave the building. Use the service elevator if you have one. Don't return to this office tonight." His face went pale. "You think they're coming here?" "I think your instincts about that phone call were correct, and I think whoever made it is running out of patience." Reddick didn't argue. He grabbed his coat and briefcase with the quick efficiency of a man who had decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. "Service elevator is at the end of the hall, past the conference room. It opens onto the loading dock." I waited until I heard the elevator descend, then made my own way to the main elevator bank. The building was quiet, holding that suspended silence of a workplace after hours, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. As the doors opened, I saw two men in the lobby below, talking to the security guard. One was tall and lean, the other built like a fire hydrant with shoulders. They weren't wearing the gray suits from earlier, but their posture had that alert stillness of professionals on the job. I pressed the button for the garage level instead of the lobby. When the doors opened, I found myself in a concrete cavern that smelled of oil and exhaust. I located the service exit, a steel door marked with warnings about alarms that had been disabled years ago, and stepped into an alley that connected to the next block. The package felt heavier with each step, as if the weight of James Ashford's fear was settling into the wrapping paper. I caught a taxi on Lexington Avenue and gave the driver the address on West 35th Street, settling back into the seat with the satisfaction of a job completed and the nagging certainty that the real work was just beginning. Whatever James Ashford had discovered, it was worth killing for. And now it was sitting in my lap, heading toward a brownstone where Nero Wolfe waited with the patience of a spider who had felt the first tremor in his web. I returned to the brownstone at 9:30. Having taken a circuitous route through 3 taxi changes and a brief walk through Macy's to ensure I wasn't trailing unwanted company. The package under my arm felt heavier with each block, as if the weight of James Ashford's fear was settling into the brown paper wrapping. Fritz met me at the door with his usual efficiency, but I caught him glancing at the street before closing it behind me, which meant he'd been watching for my return. In the office, the scene had evolved. Margaret Ashford remained in the red leather chair, but Saul Panzer now occupied one of the yellow chairs, his notebook open and his expression carrying that alert stillness that meant he'd been gathering intelligence. Wolfe looked up from a book about Byzantine taxation systems as I approached his desk, his eyes shifting immediately to the package. "Success," I announced, placing the wrapped bundle on his blotter. Mr. Reddick was cooperative and nervous in equal measure. He also received a phone call about an hour before I arrived from someone claiming to be James, asking for the package back. Reddick didn't buy it, which probably saved both our necks. "Describe the caller's approach," Wolfe said, reaching for his paper knife. "Hurried, frantic." Reddick said it didn't sound like the methodical James he knew. When Reddick asked about the Tamerlane reference, the caller laughed it off and said there was no time for games. I settled into my desk chair. Also, 2 professionals arrived in the lobby as I was leaving through the service entrance. They had the look of men who weren't planning to take no for an answer. Saul looked up from his notes. "I can confirm that. Same 2 who hit the book bindery earlier. They're working for someone with resources and no patience for subtlety." Wolfe slit the wrapping with surgical precision, revealing a leather document case secured with brass clasps. Inside, nestled in protective tissue, lay 3 items that immediately commanded the room's attention. The manuscript itself was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 9 inches by 6, bound in cracked burgundy leather with brass corners that had turned green with age. Beside it lay a modern notebook filled with James's careful handwriting, and beneath both was a sealed envelope addressed to Nero Wolfe in the same precise script. Wolfe opened the envelope first, extracting 2 pages of typescript that he read with the concentrated attention he usually reserved for orchid catalogues. When he finished, he passed them to me without comment, which in Wolfe's vocabulary meant the contents were both important and troubling. The letter was dated 4 days ago and written with the clarity of a man who knew he was running out of time. James explained that the visible text was a 13th century theological treatise of minimal scholarly value, but beneath it lay something far more significant. Using multispectral imaging, he had revealed an underlying document from approximately 1191 containing detailed genealogical records and property transfers related to the Pemberton family and several other prominent European lineages. "The implications are staggering," James had written. "These records document the systematic appropriation of church property during the Norman invasions, including gold, relics, and vast land holdings that were never returned. The foundation of several major fortunes, including the Pemberton estate, currently being liquidated by Evelyn Pemberton, rests on documented theft. If authenticated and made public, these records would invalidate centuries of property claims and challenge the legitimacy of hereditary titles worth hundreds of millions of dollars." I finished reading and looked up to find everyone watching me. "So it's not just about history, it's about money. Lots of money." "Indeed," Wolfe said, carefully lifting the manuscript from its case. "Dr. Ashford discovered something that certain parties would pay handsomely to acquire and others would kill to suppress." He opened the cover with reverence, revealing pages of dense medieval script illuminated with gold leaf and lapis lazuli. Under the bright light of his desk lamp, I could see faint, ghostly markings beneath the visible text, like shadows of words that had been scrubbed away but refused to disappear completely. "A palimpsest," Wolfe murmured, reaching for his magnifying glass. Vellum was precious. Scribes often scraped away older texts to write new ones over them. Usually they destroyed pagan poetry or obsolete legal documents, but sometimes they destroyed inconvenient truth. He moved the glass slowly across the page, his lips moving silently as he passed the faded script beneath. "The upper text is merely camouflage. The lower text is the explosive device." Margaret leaned forward, her hands clenched in her lap. "Can you read what it says?" "With difficulty. The scriptio inferior requires chemical enhancement for full legibility, but the general content is clear. This page details the transfer of assets from the Abbey of Saint-Denis to the family of de Pimberton during the Third Crusade. Gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, land grants, all appropriated for safekeeping during the religious wars and never returned." He turned the page carefully. "The spelling has evolved over 8 centuries, but the lineage is unmistakable. This is a catalogue of theft that became the foundation of a fortune." "But that was 800 years ago," I said. "The statute of limitations on medieval robbery expired before Shakespeare learned to write." "Legally, perhaps, but morally and financially." Wolfe closed the manuscript and wrapped it again. "If this document proves that the Pemberton estate was built on stolen church property, every sale Evelyn Pemberton has made becomes questionable. The collectors who have been buying these items for decades suddenly own stolen goods. The reputation of the family, their social position, their right to the property they're liquidating, all of it collapses." Saul spoke from his position against the wall. "That explains the European angle. If Lane represents a consortium of collectors, they've been buying hot merchandise for years without knowing it. This manuscript makes their collections worthless and potentially criminal." The phone rang with the sharp insistence of bad news arriving ahead of schedule. I picked it up on the second ring. "Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking." The voice on the other end was cultured, with the kind of precise diction that comes from expensive schools and careful practice. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Everett Walsh. I believe you recently acquired something that belongs to me. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer for its return." I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe, who made a small gesture indicating I should continue. "What kind of offer are we discussing, Mr. Walsh?" $200,000. Cash, delivered within the hour. In return, you give me the manuscript and any copies or analysis Dr. Ashford may have prepared. You also receive information about Dr. Ashford's current whereabouts." "You're saying you know where he is?" "I'm saying his continued well-being depends on the swift resolution of this matter. I'm not an unreasonable man, Mr. Goodwin. I have no interest in prolonging this situation unnecessarily, but I have associates who are less patient, and if they decide to take direct action, the consequences will be regrettable for everyone involved." I looked at Wolfe, who was studying the wrapped manuscript with the expression of a chess master who had just seen his opponent's fatal mistake. "Where and when?" "The parking garage on West 42nd Street, 3rd level, northeast corner, 11 o'clock tonight. Come alone, bring everything, and this unpleasant business concludes to everyone's satisfaction." "And if we decline?" "Then Dr. Ashford's value as a source of information diminishes considerably, and my associates will pursue more direct methods of acquisition. I trust you understand the implications." The line went dead. I hung up and repeated the conversation for the room. Margaret was on her feet before I finished, her composure finally cracking. "We have to go. If there's any chance James is alive—" "Sit down, Miss Ashford," Wolfe said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Mr. Walsh is lying about several things, possibly everything. This is not a negotiation. It's an execution disguised as a business transaction." He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for 10 seconds, which meant he was arranging facts like pieces on a chessboard. When he opened them, his expression carried the settled certainty of a man who had seen the endgame. "Archie, we're going to give Mr. Walsh exactly what he wants, but we're going to do it on our terms, not his. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have information about a kidnapping and need his personal attention. Then call Mr. Lane and inform him that the situation has accelerated beyond his control and that his presence is required here within the hour." "You're setting a trap," I said. "I'm creating a situation where truth has room to breathe and lies have nowhere to hide. Mr. Walsh believes he holds all the advantages. It's time to demonstrate the difference between having information and understanding its implications. The clock on his desk showed 10:15. In 45 minutes, we would learn whether James Ashford was still alive and whether 8 centuries of buried secrets were worth killing for in the modern world. Inspector Kramer arrived at 10:45, bringing with him the particular brand of controlled irritation that comes from being summoned by Nero Wolfe during what should have been his dinner hour. He stood in the office doorway, still wearing his overcoat, his jaw working around an unlit cigar, his eyes taking in the assembled company with the weary suspicion of a man who knew that wherever Wolfe was involved, simple cases became complicated, and complicated cases became nightmares. "All right, Wolfe," he said, settling into the red leather chair without invitation. "Goodwin says you've got a kidnapping, extortion, and enough medieval history to choke a horse. This better not be another one of your intellectual exercises disguised as police work." Wolfe inclined his head a precise quarter-inch. "Inspector, Dr. James Ashford has been missing for 36 hours. His disappearance is connected to his acquisition and authentication of a manuscript that threatens to expose 8 centuries of documented theft. 3 parties have demonstrated violent interest in acquiring this document. One of them, Everett Walsh, telephoned 20 minutes ago demanding we deliver the manuscript to him at 11 o'clock tonight, or Dr. Ashford dies." Kramer leaned forward, the cigar forgotten. "Walsh, I know that name. High-end fence, art theft, connections to some very unpleasant people. If he's got the professor, this isn't a negotiation, it's an execution with a timetable. Precisely why I require your cooperation. Mr. Walsh has specified the parking garage on West 42nd Street, 3rd level, northeast corner. He expects Mr. Goodwin to arrive alone with the manuscript and all related materials. He has offered $200,000 and information about Dr. Ashford's location." "Standard setup for a double cross," Kramer said. "He takes the goods, kills the messenger, and the witness disappears permanently." He looked at the wrapped manuscript on Wolfe's desk. "That the real thing?" "It is. However, Mr. Goodwin will not be carrying it to the rendezvous." The doorbell rang with the sharp insistence of someone who had been kept waiting too long. I went to answer it and found Victor Lane on the stoop. No longer the composed dealer from earlier, but a man whose careful facade was cracking under pressure. Behind him stood a woman in her late 40s, elegantly dressed but radiating fury like heat from a furnace. "Mr. Goodwin," Lane said, his cultured accent fraying at the edges. "This is Evelyn Pemberton. When I informed her of the situation, she insisted on accompanying me." Evelyn Pemberton pushed past both of us into the hall. "Where is it?" she demanded. "Where's the manuscript that belongs to my family?" I led them to the office, where Wolfe observed their entrance with the detached interest of an entomologist watching particularly aggressive specimens. Margaret Ashford stiffened when she saw Evelyn, and Kramer's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. "Mrs. Pemberton," Wolfe said without rising, "you are not welcome in my home, but since you have arrived uninvited, you may contribute to the evening's resolution. Sit down and remain silent until I address you directly." She opened her mouth to protest, but something in Wolfe's expression stopped her. She took one of the yellow chairs with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle. Lane settled beside her, his eyes moving nervously between the manuscript and the faces around him. "Now then," Wolfe continued, "we have established that Mr. Walsh expects a transaction at 11 o'clock. What he will receive instead is Mr. Goodwin carrying a package containing Dr. Ashford's research notes and photographs, but not the original manuscript. Inspector Kramer's men will be positioned to arrest Mr. Walsh and his associates when they reveal themselves." "And if they don't have the professor with them?" Kramer asked. "They will not. Mr. Walsh is not so foolish as to bring his only leverage to a potentially hostile meeting. However, his associates will have instructions to contact him when the transaction is complete. That communication will lead us to Dr. Ashford's location." Evelyn leaned forward. "You're all missing the point. That manuscript was stolen from my family's estate. It should never have been sold to that meddling professor in the first place. Mrs. Pemberton, Wolfe said with deadly calm, the manuscript documents the theft committed by your ancestors 8 centuries ago. It proves that your family fortune was built on the systematic appropriation of church property during the Crusades. Dr. Ashford's authentication threatens to invalidate not only your current estate sales, but the legitimacy of every transaction your family has made for generations. Her face went white. That's impossible. Your family records omit the inconvenient details that this palimpsest preserves. The underlying text is a contemporary accounting of assets transferred from the Abbey of Saint-Denis to the de Pemberton family for safekeeping during the Third Crusade. Assets that were never returned. Wolfe opened the manuscript case and displayed the document. Gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, land grants, relics of considerable value, all appropriated under the guise of protection and retained through simple theft. Lane cleared his throat. Mr. Wolfe, surely we can reach an accommodation. My clients are prepared to ensure proper preservation. Your clients are prepared to bury this evidence to protect their own collections and reputations. They have been purchasing items from the Pemberton estate for decades, believing them to be legitimate. This manuscript proves they have been acquiring stolen ecclesiastical property. Margaret spoke for the first time since the others had arrived. What about my brother? All this history doesn't matter if James is dead. Wolfe turned his attention to her with something approaching gentleness. Miss Ashford, your brother is not in Mr. Walsh's custody. He never was. That was a bluff designed to force our compliance. How can you possibly know that? Because Dr. Ashford is a methodical man who anticipated this situation. The letter he left with Mr. Reddick contained a reference that only you would understand. What did he mean by the Tamerlane reference? Margaret's eyes widened with sudden comprehension. It's an old family joke. When we were children, James found a first edition of Poe's Tamerlane at a yard sale. He paid 50 cents for something worth thousands. He always said if he ever needed to disappear, he'd hide in plain sight at a used bookstore, waiting for someone smart enough to recognize real value. And there is a particular establishment he favored. The Strand. He spent every Saturday morning there for 20 years. Wolfe looked at Kramer. Inspector, I suggest you send officers to the Strand bookstore immediately. You will find Dr. Ashford in the rare books section, probably reading Chaucer and waiting for word that it is safe to emerge. Kramer was already reaching for his radio. This better be right, Wolfe. It is right. Dr. Ashford created the appearance of kidnapping to protect both himself and the manuscript. Mr. Walsh fell for the deception and has been negotiating for something he never possessed. Wolfe checked his watch. Which brings us to the present moment. Mr. Goodwin, you will proceed to the garage with a package containing sufficient authentic materials to satisfy cursory inspection. Inspector Kramer will coordinate the arrest. The rest of you will remain here until Dr. Ashford is located and this matter reaches its proper conclusion. I picked up the prepared package, checked my gun, and headed for the door with Kramer close behind. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the promise of complications yet to come. But for the first time since this began, I felt like we were ahead of the game instead of chasing it. Behind us, the brownstone held its secrets and its assembled suspects, while Wolfe orchestrated the endgame from his chair with the patience of a master chess player who had finally seen his opponent's fatal mistake. The ride to West 42nd Street took 15 minutes through traffic that moved like cold honey. Kramer sat in the back of the unmarked sedan, working his unlit cigar between his teeth with the methodical intensity of a man who had learned that patience was the difference between successful arrests and newspaper headlines about dead cops. I sat beside him, the decoy package resting on my lap, feeling the weight of James Ashford's research notes and photographs wrapped in brown paper that looked convincingly like the original manuscript case. The parking garage breathed out the smell of oil, exhaust, and urban decay. Kramer's men had positioned themselves with professional efficiency, invisible to casual observation but ready to move on his signal. I took the elevator to the 3rd level, my footsteps echoing against bare concrete as I walked toward the northeast corner where a black sedan waited with its engine running and windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. Everett Walsh emerged as I approached, and he looked exactly like what he was, expensive, dangerous, and completely out of place in a concrete tomb that smelled of gasoline and failure. He wore a camel hair overcoat and moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had spent decades getting away with things that would have destroyed lesser criminals. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his cultured voice carrying easily in the hollow space. "Punctual as promised. I trust you brought everything we discussed." "Everything Dr. Ashford compiled," I replied, holding up the package but staying 10 feet away. "Research notes, photographs, authentication records. But first, I want proof that the professor is alive and well." Walsh's smile was the kind that made you want to count your fingers afterward. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm disappointed. I expected more sophistication from someone in Nero Wolfe's employ." His composure was perfect, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Dr. Ashford was never in my custody. He disappeared quite cleverly on his own and has been hiding while you people chase shadows." "Then why the charade about trading for his location?" "Because threatening a man's life is more effective than offering money to someone who works for Nero Wolfe. Your employer prioritizes principle over profit, which makes him predictably difficult to negotiate with." He gestured toward the package. "Now shall we conclude our business?" I tossed the package, watching it arc through the air and land at his feet. Walsh bent to retrieve it, greed overcoming caution for just a moment. That was when the garage exploded with light and sound. Floodlights blazed from 3 directions as unmarked police cars roared up the ramps. Kramer's voice boomed through a megaphone, announcing that they were surrounded and ordering weapons to be dropped. Walsh's associate, the fire hydrant with shoulders, pulled a gun and fired twice in my direction before police revolvers answered him. He spun and went down, clutching his shoulder. Walsh froze, the package in his hands, looking like a man who had just realized his expensive lawyers were about to earn their fees. 20 minutes later, we were back at the brownstone. The office blazed with light, and seated in the red leather chair was a thin man with spectacles and nervous energy who looked like he had been assembled from tweed and anxiety. James Ashford clutched a cup of Fritz's hot chocolate while Margaret held his hand with the fierce protectiveness of an older sister who had nearly lost her only family. Kramer confirmed that Walsh was in custody and singing about extortion, though still claiming legal rights to the manuscript. The shooter was at the hospital under guard, and the district attorney was preparing enough charges to keep everyone busy until the next century. Wolfe surveyed the assembled company with the satisfaction of a chess master who had just achieved checkmate in 12 moves. "Dr. Ashford, I trust your sojourn among the rare books was educational." James pushed his glasses up his nose. I knew Margaret would figure out the Tamerlane reference eventually. I just hoped it wouldn't take quite this long. "Your strategy was sound, if dramatic. However, we now have more pressing matters." Wolfe's gaze moved to Evelyn Pemberton and Victor Lane, who sat in rigid silence. "The immediate threat of violence has passed, but the matter of historical justice remains." Evelyn stood, her composure cracking. "That manuscript belongs to my family. I demand its immediate return." "Mrs. Pemberton, possession may be 9/10 of the law, but truth occupies the remaining 10th, and in this room, truth is the only currency I accept." Wolfe opened the manuscript case, revealing the ancient document within. This palimpsest documents 8 centuries of theft disguised as safekeeping. Your family fortune was built on stolen ecclesiastical property, and every transaction you have made carries that taint. Lane shifted uncomfortably. My clients are prepared to offer substantial compensation for the manuscript's discreet preservation. $2 million, Mr. Wolfe. Mr. Lane, I'm not in the business of suppressing historical truth for the convenience of thieves and their descendants. Wolfe's voice carried absolute finality. The manuscript will be donated to Columbia University, where Dr. Ashford will oversee its authentication and publication. Some truths are too important to suppress, regardless of whose fortunes they threaten. James stood, his scholarly authority replacing his earlier nervousness. The world deserves to know what lies beneath the surface. 800 years of buried history demands daylight. Wolfe nodded once. Indeed. Mrs. Pemberton, I suggest you consult attorneys who specialize in estate litigation. You will need them. Mr. Lane, inform your clients that any attempt to suppress this document will result in public exposure of their involvement. After the exodus of suspects and police, the brownstone settled back into its familiar rhythms. I closed the office door and turned to find Wolfe contemplating the wrapped manuscript with the expression of a man who had just finished a particularly satisfying meal. So, I said, settling into my desk chair, we've rescued a professor, arrested a fence, humiliated an heiress, and given medieval monks the last word. Not bad for a Tuesday night. Your penchant for summary remains both amusing and imprecise, Wolfe replied, reaching for his beer. We have merely nudged an old injustice into the light. What happens now is beyond our control and, I might add, beyond our responsibility. Still, you could have buried that thing or sold it to Lane's people. Instead, you're sending it to academics who actually care about footnotes. That's almost sentimental. Phooey. This is about appetite, Archie. Men like Walsh consume value without understanding it. Mrs. Pemberton consumed privilege without examining its source. Their hunger is indiscriminate and leaves nothing behind but emptiness. He took a slow sip and set down his glass. The academics, even Lane's clients, at least understand that some things must be digested slowly, with consideration. That is the difference between civilization and gluttony. I pulled out my notebook. And where do we rank in this grand food chain? We are merely the palate. We distinguish flavors, note when something is rotten, and occasionally, when forced, spit it out in public. His eyes half closed. You are working for a world where 800-year-old crimes still demand fresh cleverness. Outside, the city continued its eternal hunger. Inside the brownstone, the air smelled of Fritz's coffee, old paper, and the faint scent of money that had just discovered it had ancestors it preferred to forget. The following morning arrived with the kind of persistent drizzle that makes Manhattan look like it's been left out overnight to soak. I came down to the office at 9 to find Wolfe already behind his desk, which violated every sacred routine of the brownstone and suggested that unfinished business was gnawing at him like a poorly prepared sauce. He was reading 3 newspapers simultaneously, a feat that would have impressed a circus performer, but merely indicated to me that he was looking for something specific in the coverage of last night's arrests. Walsh made bail, he said without looking up from the financial section. Posted by attorneys representing what the Times delicately calls cultural preservation interests. The district attorney is quoted as being disappointed but not surprised by the judge's decision. I poured coffee from Fritz's morning service and settled at my desk. Lane's consortium decided their fence was more valuable outside than inside, where he might start naming clients to reduce his sentence. Undoubtedly. However, Mr. Walsh's freedom creates complications that require immediate attention. Wolfe folded the newspapers with the precision of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. Dr. Ashford telephoned at 7:30. He received visitors at his apartment this morning who suggested that certain scholarly conclusions might benefit from reconsideration before publication. The kind of visitors who make suggestions with their hands in their coat pockets? The kind who make suggestions while examining the security arrangements of university buildings and noting the schedules of night watchmen. He reached for his beer, which Fritz had provided despite the early hour and the violation of established protocol. Dr. Ashford is understandably concerned. His sister is prepared to hire bodyguards and barricade him in the rare books collection until this resolves itself. The doorbell rang with the urgent rhythm of someone who had been rehearsing bad news during the taxi ride over. I went to answer it and found Professor Kearns on the stoop, looking like a man who had discovered that academic politics could involve actual violence when sufficient money was at stake. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, pushing past me with uncharacteristic aggression, "the university administration received communications overnight from several major donors. They're threatening to withdraw funding if we proceed with publishing the Pemberton manuscript." I led him to the office, where Wolfe observed his entrance with the detached interest of a chess master watching an opponent make a predictable move. Kearns took the red leather chair without invitation and launched into what sounded like a prepared statement about institutional survival versus academic principle. "The board meets this afternoon to decide whether Columbia can afford to alienate families whose endowments fund half our operating budget," he said, his voice carrying the strain of a man caught between conscience and pragmatism. "We're talking about $20 million annually, Mr. Wolfe. That's not abstract principle. That's faculty salaries and building maintenance and student scholarships." "Professor Kearns," Wolfe said with dangerous calm, "are you informing me that Columbia University intends to suppress historical evidence because it embarrasses wealthy benefactors?" "I'm informing you that universities exist in the real world, where idealism must sometimes yield to financial reality. If we lose that funding, we lose the ability to preserve any manuscripts, controversial or otherwise. Then perhaps Columbia deserves to lose that ability." Wolfe's voice carried absolute finality. An institution that trades truth for endowments has already surrendered what makes it worth preserving. The phone rang before Kearns could respond. I picked it up to hear Saul Panza's voice, tight with professional concern. "Archie, movement at the Ashford building. 2 cars, 4 men, surveillance equipment. They're setting up for a long watch." I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe. "Saul says James is about to acquire some very attentive neighbors." Wolfe's expression didn't change, but his fingers drummed once on his desk blotter. "Tell him to document but not engage. Then call Inspector Kramer and inform him that persons connected to yesterday's arrests are conducting surveillance of a potential witness." I relayed the message while Wolfe turned his attention back to Kearns. "Professor, you will return to your board with a simple message. Any attempt to suppress this manuscript will result in its immediate publication through channels beyond university control. Dr. Ashford has prepared authenticated copies for distribution to major newspapers and academic journals. Columbia can choose to be celebrated for scholarly courage or condemned for institutional cowardice, but they cannot prevent the truth from emerging." Kearns went pale. "You're bluffing. James would never bypass proper academic procedures." "Dr. Ashford is currently under surveillance by people who believe scholars can be intimidated into silence. He has learned that proper procedures sometimes lead to improper outcomes." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "However, if Columbia stands firm and publishes with full academic rigor, they will be remembered for integrity rather than capitulation. The choice belongs to your board, but the consequences are already in motion." After Kearns departed, looking like a man who had just discovered his comfortable world contained sharp edges, I turned to Wolfe with the question that had been building since dawn. "You're forcing everyone into corners simultaneously. What happens when they all decide to fight back at once?" "They reveal their true priorities when pretense becomes impossible," Wolfe replied, reaching for his beer. "Mrs. Sun, Pemberton values social position above historical truth. Mr. Lane values client relationships above scholarly integrity. Professor Kearns values institutional survival above academic principle. Each believes they can negotiate their way out of consequences. And you're proving they can't. I'm demonstrating that some truths become too large to suppress once they've been properly authenticated and strategically positioned." The manuscript exists in multiple secure locations. The authentication is complete and documented. Federal authorities are now involved due to interstate commerce in stolen artifacts. All that remains is watching people choose between their interests and their integrity. The phone rang again. Kramer's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had just finished making arrests and wanted to share the details. "Wolfe, we picked up the surveillance team at the Ashford building. They had enough electronic equipment to monitor a small country and cache that suggests they weren't planning community service. Inspector, I trust this provides sufficient grounds to revoke Mr. Walsh's bail?" "More than sufficient. He'll be back in a cell within the hour, and this time the bail hearing will include federal prosecutors who take a dim view of witness intimidation." There was a pause. "You know, Wolfe, sometimes I think you plan these things 3 moves ahead." "Only 3, Inspector. You underestimate me." By noon, the dominoes were falling in precisely the order Wolfe had arranged. The FBI had opened a formal investigation into interstate trafficking in stolen historical artifacts. Columbia's board had voted to proceed with publication after consulting lawyers who explained the federal implications of suppressing evidence. Evelyn Pemberton's attorneys had withdrawn their injunctions after discovering that fighting federal prosecutors required resources beyond even her substantial means. When Wolfe ascended to the plant rooms at 11 o'clock, the case had transformed from a mystery into a demonstration of how truth, properly leveraged, becomes irresistible. I sat at my desk, updating files and reflecting on how many people would spend the coming years wishing they had never heard of a 13th century palimpsest that refused to stay buried in the comfortable darkness where inconvenient truths usually reside. The brownstone settled into its familiar rhythms, but with the satisfaction of a house that had once again proved that some hungers can only be satisfied by the complete and unvarnished truth. 2 days later, on Friday evening, the brownstone had settled back into its familiar rhythms like a cat returning to a favorite chair. The October air carried the sharp promise of winter, and Fritz had lit a fire in the office grate that cast dancing shadows across the spines of Wolfe's books. I was at my desk, updating the orchid records that had been neglected during the medieval manuscript crisis, while Wolfe sat behind his desk reading a treatise on Balkan political history with the concentration of a man who found other people's ancient feuds more palatable than their modern ones. The morning papers had covered the Pemberton Codex story with the breathless enthusiasm that newspapers reserve for scandals involving old money and older crimes. The Times headline read, "Medieval Manuscript Exposes Century-Old Theft," while the Post had gone with "Holy Grail of Guilt Trips." James Ashford's photograph appeared in 3 different publications, looking uncomfortable with sudden fame, but determined to see the authentication process through to its conclusion. Everett Walsh had accepted a plea bargain that would keep him in federal custody long enough to forget what stolen manuscripts looked like, while Evelyn Pemberton had retreated to her Connecticut estate to contemplate the difference between inherited wealth and inherited guilt. At 6 o'clock, a courier delivered a thick envelope addressed to Nero Wolfe. Inside was a check for our full fee plus expenses, signed by Margaret Ashford in her precise handwriting, along with a note expressing gratitude that managed to be both formal and heartfelt. She mentioned that James had returned to his classroom, where his students were now asking pointed questions about the Crusades that weren't covered in the syllabus, and that Victor Lane had sent a case of very old brandy along with a formal apology for his role in the affair. Wolfe examined the check with satisfaction, then placed it beneath his paperweight. "Mr. Lane understands the value of graceful surrender," he said. "He has chosen pragmatism over pride, which suggests intelligence beneath the expensive tailoring." Fritz announced dinner at 7:15 with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. We moved to the dining room, where he had prepared one of Wolfe's seasonal favorites, roasted duck with cherry sauce, accompanied by braised endive and a salad dressed with his secret vinaigrette. The meal proceeded with the ritualistic silence that Wolfe demands, allowing the mind to reset from the chaos of criminal investigation to the ordered perfection of proper gastronomy. Wolfe approached his duck with surgical precision, his face reflecting the intense concentration of a man who believes that a perfectly prepared meal represents civilization's highest achievement. Back in the office afterward, with coffee served and the fire settling into a steady glow, the atmosphere shifted to that reflective mood that follows the successful conclusion of a complex case. Wolfe poured beer from the bottle Fritz had brought, watching the foam rise with critical attention. "You know," I said, swiveling my chair to face him, "I keep thinking about the title we gave this case. The Vanished Man on 35th Avenue. James vanished to save himself, but he was never really the vanished man, was he?" Wolfe set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. "Indeed not. Dr. Ashford merely made himself temporarily invisible while ensuring that the truth remained permanently visible. The real vanished man was history itself. For 8 centuries, the theft documented in that palimpsest had been erased, scrubbed away as thoroughly as the original text beneath the theological treatise. But it never really disappeared. Nothing truly disappears, Archie. It is merely transformed. The gold stolen from the Abbey of Saint-Denis became the Pemberton estate. It became political influence, social position, and fine art collections. The crime was transmuted into respectability through the simple alchemy of time and careful forgetting. We call it civilization, but often it is merely successful larceny with an extended statute of limitations." He reached for his beer again. Mrs. Pemberton wanted to continue dining on inherited illusions. Mr. Lane's consortium wished to season their collections with selected truths while discarding inconvenient ones. Mr. Walsh simply wanted to consume the past without regard for its nutritional value. They all preferred the comfortable amnesia of the status quo. So we were what? Historical indigestion? We were the palate, Archie. We distinguished between authentic and artificial flavors, noted when something had spoiled and when necessary, spat out what was rotten. His eyes held that gleam of satisfaction that comes from a case properly concluded. The manuscript was enigmatic that forced them to disgorge truths they had swallowed and forgotten. It is rarely a dignified process, but it is necessary for the health of the collective memory. I looked at the check on his desk, then at the newspaper with its headlines about justice and scholarship. Well, truth pays better than I expected, and it has better staying power than duck with cherry sauce. "Do not disparage the duck," Wolfe said with mock severity. The duck was honest. It pretended to be nothing other than what it was, unlike our various antagonists who specialized in elaborate imposture. In a world of systematic deception, a properly prepared meal remains one of the few authentic experiences available. He opened his book, signaling the end of the evening's discussion. The case was closed, the fee banked, and the brownstone had returned to its proper function as a fortress of logic and appetite in a city that often possessed neither. I turned back to my typewriter to finish the final report, the keys clicking in the familiar rhythm that meant order had been restored. Outside, the October night settled over West 35th Street like a comfortable blanket. James Ashford was safe among his books and students. The Pemberton fortune was being dissected by federal investigators and estate lawyers. And Nero Wolfe was reading about Balkan politics while digesting duck and contemplating the eternal struggle between truth and convenience. "Good night, sir," I said, covering my typewriter. "Good night, Archie," he replied without looking up from his book. I walked to the front hall to secure the locks, thinking about vanished men and vanished truths, about the layers of history buried beneath respectability, and about the occasional satisfaction of dragging something important back into the light. The street outside was quiet and dark, holding its secrets close. But inside the brownstone, all accounts were balanced, all hungers satisfied, and all truths properly seasoned and served at the correct temperature. 10 days after the arrests, the final piece of the puzzle arrived at the brownstone in the form of James Ashford himself, carrying a leather-bound volume that smelled of fresh ink and academic vindication. The morning had dawned crisp and clear, with October sunlight streaming through the office windows and casting geometric patterns across Wolfe's desk. I was updating the Orchid records when the doorbell rang at 11:30, and through the one-way glass, I saw the professor standing on our stoop, no longer the terrified man who had hidden among used books, but someone who looked like he'd remembered how to sleep through the night. I let him in and led him to the office, where Wolfe was examining a catalogue of Byzantine manuscripts with the concentration of a man who found other people's ancient obsessions more palatable than their modern ones. He looked up as we entered, his eyes immediately focusing on the package in James's hands. "Dr. Ashford," he said without rising, "you have the appearance of a man who has seen his work properly concluded." James settled into the red leather chair and placed the package on Wolfe's desk with reverent care. "The first copy off the press," he said, unwrapping it to reveal a handsome volume titled The Pemberton Palimpsest, Historical Theft and Medieval Blackmail. The cover featured a high-resolution photograph of the manuscript page where ghostly text was visible beneath the surface writing. "Columbia rushed it through production. The academic response has been extraordinary." Wolfe opened the book, examining the frontispiece and table of contents with approval. "And the public reception? Beyond anything we expected, the story has captured imaginations. People are fascinated by the idea that 800-year-old crimes are still causing trouble for their descendants." James leaned forward with scholarly enthusiasm. 3 universities want to examine the manuscript independently. The Vatican has requested access to verify whether any of their collections might be affected. And we've received inquiries from collectors throughout Europe who are suddenly concerned about the provenance of their medieval acquisitions. I swiveled my chair to face them. "What about the Pemberton estate? Has Evelyn emerged from her Connecticut bunker?" "Her lawyers have been busy. They're challenging every sale made in the past 5 years, trying to establish that the buyers were aware of potential ownership issues. It's going to be years of litigation." James' expression grew more serious. "But there's been another development. I received an offer yesterday from a consortium of London dealers. They want to fund my research indefinitely, complete academic freedom, access to private collections throughout Europe. The only condition is that I consult with them before publishing anything that might affect contemporary property claims." Wolfe set down his beer glass with a soft click. "The price of your silence, disguised as scholarly patronage." "Exactly. And the amount is substantial enough to fund decades of work." James looked at Wolfe with the expression of a man seeking confirmation rather than advice. "I wanted your opinion before responding." "You have already decided," Wolfe said with certainty. "You came here for validation, not guidance. You will refuse them completely and publicly, then publish their offer, along with your rejection. Any scholar who accepts such constraints ceases to be a scholar and becomes merely an expensive antiquarian." James nodded, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Margaret said you would tell me exactly that. She also said I should listen because you understand the difference between being clever and being right. Your sister demonstrates wisdom. However, I must address one matter that has troubled me throughout this case." Wolfe opened the book to the appendix containing the full Latin transcription. "Dr. Ashford, you focused your analysis on the inventory of stolen goods, but examine this marginal notation on the final folio. The handwriting differs from the main scribe." James adjusted his glasses, peering at the cramped text. "I noticed that, but assumed it was a later addition." "Perhaps a prayer or blessing." "It is neither. It is the key to understanding why this document survived 8 centuries when logic dictated it should have been destroyed." Wolfe's finger traced the faded script. Translated roughly, it reads, "Held in trust against the silence of the bishop regarding the matter at Rouen." "Do you comprehend the implications?" James' eyes widened as understanding dawned. the heresy investigations. The Bishop of Rouen was conducting trials for religious crimes that carried death sentences. Precisely. This manuscript was not merely evidence of theft. It was a blackmail ledger. The de Pimberton family had stolen church property, but they kept meticulous records to prove the church had entrusted these items to them, implying a complicity that would have destroyed the bishop if revealed. The document survived because it was a weapon in a standoff that lasted lifetimes. I whistled softly. Mutually assured destruction, medieval style. The thief couldn't burn the evidence without losing his leverage, and the church couldn't reclaim the property without exposing corruption. Indeed, the manuscript that Evelyn Pemberton fought to suppress was originally created to save her ancestor from execution. The irony is that she nearly succeeded in destroying the very document that had preserved her family line. Wolfe closed the book with satisfaction. The past is never as simple as we imagine, Dr. Ashford. We prefer to see monsters or saints, but usually we find only frightened people making desperate bargains. The room fell into comfortable silence. James gathered his composure and stood, extending his hand to Wolfe. "Thank you. For everything. The truth and the wisdom, both." After I'd shown him out, I returned to find Wolfe reading the published manuscript with the attention he usually reserved for cookbooks. "You knew about the blackmail angle all along," I said, settling at my desk. "I suspected it. The psychology never aligned properly. Why preserve evidence of your own crime unless that evidence served another purpose?" He looked up from the book. The margin notation confirmed what logic had already suggested. In chess, pieces that survive do so because they serve multiple functions. And now the past has been properly digested and can nourish the present. The truth has been served at the correct temperature, and those with appetite for it may consume it freely. He reached for his beer. "Fritz is preparing duck with cherry sauce for lunch. It would be a tragedy to let it grow cold while we debate the ethics of dead bishops." I covered my typewriter and filed the case folder in our safe. Outside, the city continued its eternal dance of commerce and deception. Inside the brownstone, another truth had been properly seasoned and served, leaving behind only the satisfying aftertaste of justice rendered and mysteries solved.